today we are going to be looking at an analysis in depth of the poem London. So hopefully you've looked at the socio-historic context video. So now we are going to be talking about the language in the poem. Now, I'm not going to lie, this poem is quite straightforward in the way that it tackles the subject matter. It's quite obviously a poem about poverty in London. It's obviously a poem about the way that poor people are mistreated. It's a poem about capitalism. It's a poem that is written as a consequence of urbanization, of poor people moving into the city due to the Industrial Revolution happening, causing them to lose their kind of country jobs. So they moved to the city in order to work in factories. Now, this kind of overflow of people moving into London caused a huge amount of poverty. It caused a huge amount of overcrowding, so a lot of people were rendered homeless because, you know, there was a housing shortage and whatnot. This is a poem in reaction to the poverty, right? And it's also a criticism of the government. Now, again, if you have watched the socio-historic context video, you'll know that William Blake was quite a unique individual. He had his own ideas about Christianity, and he had his own ideas about politics. Now, he often would switch between different ideas concerning politics, but he had the right idea most of the time. He had a solid sense of morals most of the time, and he was quite the socialist. He was also a feminist, and he was also against slavery. So he was a very good man. Okay, that we know of course. Like, you never know what someone's like just by reading it on Wikipedia, but from what I've read, he seems like a very good man. So yeah, a lot of his poems were against the Industrial Revolution. And again, if you watch the context video, you'll know that Blake himself was very much against urbanization, against the Industrial Revolution. Now, there are pros and cons to this Industrial Revolution, but Blake, of course, disliked the amount of poverty that it caused, and he was very against institutions like the government, like the church. Both these institutions had a huge amount of power in this time. He was very against the idea of shutting down manual labour in the countryside, forcing a lot of poor people to come into the city and then not providing them with jobs, or providing them with dangerous and horrible jobs which they were underpaid for. So let's begin to analyse the language. I wander through each charted street is the first line. First of all, I want us to note that there is a subject, I. So immediately we start off with this I. Now, whoever this subject is, most likely it is Blake himself. He is wandering through each charted street. There's a sense of, I guess, a personality being introduced. It's not just an observation of what's going on in these streets. Immediately there's this I, there's a person, and you get this idea of a man walking through the streets, looking at what's going on around him. Blake didn't have to do this. He could have just started off with each charted street where the charted Thames does flow. He could have just started it without a subject I, but he purposefully has put in this person, this image of a person, maybe himself again, walking through the streets, and it immediately introduces you to a human being. There is a person walking through the streets. He's observing. There's a sense of observation, the sense of looking at what's going on around you, opening your eyes and seeing. Now, I definitely think that there's a reason for this I definitely think that there's this idea of being alert to your surroundings, of actually not just walking through the streets and getting to your destination, but actually walking through the streets and looking at the poverty that surrounds you. It's almost as if Blake is saying, hey, right now it's me walking through the streets, but it could very well be you. Open your eyes, look at what's going on around you. And remember, this poem would have been read by people who could read in the time, and most likely people who could read in the time were rich, or middle class at least. So yes, it's very much an idea of opening your eyes and observing what's going on around you. As well as this, in the 18th and 19th century, there was this introduction of the flaneur. And don't be scared of this word. It's basically a French word, and it is a man who wanders around observing society. So a flaneur is a man who wanders around observing society. Flaneur. Flaneur. And Blake is this flaneur, or at least his subject is a flaneur, a man who is wandering around the streets observing society. So it's always good to use these kind of words, especially since there is a specific word for this in literature. This idea of a man walking around, just observing, just seeing what's around him. Now, usually the flaneur, he wouldn't get involved directly, he would just be kind of at a distance observing. And most usually the flaneur was also a pretty kind of middle class kind of man. He was kind of distanced from society, observing it and looking at it. And it was a very kind of this obvious sense of distance between the flaneur and the society that he was observing, this very kind of eagle-eyed approach or bird's eye view approach that he witnesses but never quite judges or never quite makes specific remarks or never quite gets involved. Now, Blake is the flaneur who is wandering through each charted street, but there is a sense that he is getting involved. He is kind of remarking on society, and we get this sense because I wander through each charted street near where the charted Thames does flow. There's this word, this adjective, charted, which is repeated. And charted, the word charted actually means to be government owned. So usually if something is chartered, it's been rented out or government owned or government approved. There's a sense that the government owns these streets. And here we got near where the charted Thames does flow. Now, if you've looked at the context video, you'll see that romantic poets, and Blake is a romantic poet, they talk about nature. Romantic poets usually, they talk about nature, and they talk about the freedom of nature and how nature is sublime, it's powerful, it reflects God. But here, this natural thing, the Thames, is actually chartered. It's almost government owned itself. So there's this idea that even the natural things like the Thames, the river, which represents or should represent something that is free, something that is free flowing, even that has been controlled by the government. This idea of being chartered, being controlled, being almost compressed or tightened by government law. So nothing is free. And even the flaneur himself, the subject, this I who's wandering through each street, is actually wandering through each government approved street. So there's this idea that the flaneur himself is not even distant from the government controlled streets. Now, chartered is also a very interesting word because it makes us think of the noun Chartism. Now, Chartism is basically a movement which happened a little bit after Blake's time, after his death. It happened in the early 1830s. Chartism was basically a male suffrage movement. Essentially, it was the movement that all men should be allowed to vote, right? So previous to this, only rich men were allowed to vote. They were allowed to vote who gets into government, who gets into power. Now, in the early 1830s, this law called Chartism happened, and that allowed all men, so no matter what station they were, no matter how poor they were all allowed to vote. So there was this kind of male suffrage movement. If you're still confused, you can look it up. But I just find it interesting that chartered is linked very closely to the word Chartism. These two words share a very similar sound. This idea of being chartered, government owned, also reminds us of the Chartism movement, this movement that even if you are poor, you should still be allowed to vote for who gets to be in power. So yes, near where the charted Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. Now the first thing I want to notice is the amount of repetition that is in this poem. This poem has a huge, huge amount of repetition. And I definitely think this is done on purpose. It gives the poem a sense of urgency. There's always a reason behind repetition. In this case, this constant reminder, due to the type of language which is repeated, in this case, marks, this noun is repeated, and the adjective charted is also repeated. It's this kind of urgent reminder that actually nothing is okay, and that you can close your eyes, but every single time this repetition is going to come out and it's going to make you open your eyes. Mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. So these marks give a sense of kind of physicality, this idea that faces around this flaneur, what he's observing, it's all around him, and he's actually meeting them. You've got this verb, meet, this idea that he is actually engaging with them and looking at them. He's really opening his eyes to the poverty around him, and he's looking at the marks of weakness, marks of woe. Look at the alliteration as well of the W, weakness, woe. This sense of, well, first of all, alliteration, but this sense of sadness, hopelessness as well. You know, this idea that people are hopeless. So I want to just point out this adjective, every. This adjective is actually repeated later on in every cry, in every infant's cry. So there's this idea of the vastness. There's this idea that so many people are affected by poverty, this huge population of poor people. It seems like everyone around him is struck by marks of weakness, struck by marks of woe. No one really is happy. The sense of everyone really engages you to think about how many people are affected by poverty. And now on to the next stanza. Again, we've got quite a lot of repetition. So first of all, we've got the repetition of the preposition in. And this kind of repetition, which starts at the beginning of every single sentence, is called anaphora. So we've got the anaphora, which is the repetition of words which begin at the beginning of sentences. So that's what it means, anaphora, of the preposition. Preposition signifies where something is, so under, below, inside, in, out. So in this case, in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice. And again, this repetition again, it's not an anaphoric repetition, but it is in the middle of the sentence, in every man. So this repetition of preposition in, especially anaphorically at the beginning of each sentence in this second stanza, really calls attention to the repeated word. So it calls attention to the repeated word, in. Attached to that preposition in is that adjective every. So in every cry of every man. And this repetition of the adjective every was also present in the first stanza as well. It's just repetition all around of different words. And when we look at repetition, we really want to think about why. Why is that word repeated? What about that word, that preposition or that adjective or that verb, makes us want to pay close attention to it? Because the reason that authors or poets repeat words is because they want to have the reader pay attention to that word. So in this case, let's focus on in. Now, the anaphoric repetition of in, which posts it at the beginning of each sentence, really highlights how misery is within. This idea of being inside, in every cry, in every voice. This sense that the misery is almost embedded, right? And what do we mean by embedded? We basically mean that it's kind of jammed in there, almost forcefully. Think about the way that the sentence is kind of constructed: in every cry, in every infant's cry, right? So it's not just adults crying, it's children crying, in every voice. And it's really accentuated by the repetition of the adjective every, by the way, which gives this sense of universal suffering. Inside, jammed, almost forcefully jammed inside every cry of every man, of every infant. Every really cements this idea, and further cements by man and infant. It's adults, it's children, it's women, it's prostitutes, it's everyone crying out. It gives a sense that everyone is suffering, and it really gives this idea that there is a huge amount of suffering going on here. And the noun man and the noun infants and the noun voice even really gives this sense that they are kind of loudly crying out. There's this idea that every voice is crying out. There's this kind of sense of volume. Think about the noun voice, right? And cry even. Think about the verb cry. There's this sense of volume, as if the voices are getting louder and louder and louder. They're being filled with more pain. They're being kind of accentuated almost. They're almost rising. And this idea of rising voices is really interesting when we look at how the French Revolution is currently going on as this poem is being written. And if you have watched the context video, you'll know that the French Revolution was a direct cause of the difference in wealth. So the rich people were very rich, and there were so many poor people, such a huge amount of poor people in France, Paris especially, again, a capital city, that all these poor people kind of combined together to revolt and were successful. They were successful in their revolution. And I'll think again about the stanza and the language that is used. So every cry, every voice. This idea that, again, Blake is really stressing that there is a universal sense of suffering here, that there is many voices crying. This verb to cry, it kind of makes us think about sadness. Yes, definitely, that is true. You cry when you're sad, but it also makes us think about it makes us think about a war cry as well. So just before you're about to enter into battle, what do warriors do? They cry out. So there's a sense of sadness, almost transforming into anger. That this verb cry could mean sadness, it could mean crying out, it could mean crying out from pain, but it could also mean crying out from a sense of anger, a sense of war, a sense of revolution, right? So in every cry of every man, yes, it's kind of a plea to the reader to pay attention to the suffering of so many poor people, but it's also, I think, a warning. And I definitely think that there is a depth to the language that Blake is using here. Every cry, right? It's a warning that actually these cries of suffering could very easily turn into cries of war, just as the French Revolution was a revolution of poor people protesting and using violence and actually using war in order to overthrow the rich aristocrats and the rich royalty. This could very well happen, and that's what Blake is saying. Now, it's important to note this never actually happened. There was no British Revolution, like there was a French Revolution, but people definitely, especially at the time that this poem was written, believed that there would be a British Revolution too, and Blake very much wanted a British Revolution. Like I said, he was a socialist. He believed in the equality of poor and rich people, and he believed that actually in order to get that equality, that poor people actually needed to cry out and start a war and actually raid the palace walls and overthrow the rich. So it never happened, but I definitely think this poem is a bit of a warning, and it hints and almost kind of urges this idea that revolution could happen and that it should happen. And I think that depth is added to by this adjective every. It really highlights how many people were suffering, were going through, extreme misery, and how that misery can very much turn into power, right? There's so many people, there's more poor people than there are rich people. So there is very easily a chance of revolution happening. Okay, and I just want to highlight this third sentence. In every voice, in every ban, okay? And I want to stress this in every ban. Now, ban actually means many different things again. Now, in this case, ban, the noun, actually means curse. And this is the most important meaning, and I think the most literal meaning. It means to curse, so to say a curse word. So in the last sentence, Blake actually writes, how the youthful harlots curse. So again, we've got this idea of anger. Every ban could very much be everyone kind of cursing out of anger. And again, we've got this kind of revolution brewing. This idea that the poor people remember, there's a flaneur walking through the streets and he's observing. These poor people who he's observing are not just crying out of misery, but they're actually cursing. They're crying out and cursing the people who have oppressed them. There's a sense of anger. Ban also has another definition. To ban someone from something means to keep them out, doesn't it? So keep people out. If you're banned from a restaurant, you're kept out of that restaurant. If you're banned from, a shop, then you're kind of not allowed to come in. This sense of barrier, this idea of not being able to enter, present in that noun, ban. People are kept out. This idea that actually so many people are kept poor, and they're kind of shunned from respectable society. They're banned. There's this barrier between the rich and the poor. This idea that the poor people who the flaneur is observing, the poor people on the streets of London, all kind of laid out in this dark, dismal city, are pretty much physically banned from rising up and becoming rich. They're physically banned from certain places, from certain establishments, because they don't have the money to enter them. There's this idea of separating and creating barriers in society, and this is known as kind of class barriers, isn't it? It's a sense of these poor people being banned from ever rising above their station, and also physically banned. So I said, the word ban means to physically stop someone from entering a place. In a lot of places, poor people weren't allowed to enter. They weren't allowed to be, in a sense, they weren't physically allowed to be near rich people. There's this sense that no one who was born poor is actually allowed to rise. There was this belief that anyone who was rich was born rich and had a right to be rich. And so there was no sense of breaking barriers in society and rising above your class. So yeah, this word ban has a lot of meaning to it, which I think attaches itself to a lot of the themes in the poem. This idea of ban being a form of anger, of cursing out, of crying out from anger and rage, but also ban as a form of oppression. Again, those two are hand in hand. Oppression creates rage. And then, of course, we've got the mind-forged manacles I hear. So, in every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. So, again, we've got this reference of I, that personal pronoun, PP, personal pronoun, which reminds us that the subject is listening. So, again, this kind of reminder that we have this subject, this I, who is walking through the streets, who is listening, who is watching, who is observing. And it's kind of, I guess, an active role that he is taking. He says he hears them. There's a sense that he actually notices them, that he is listening to them, that almost he's paying attention to them for the first time. There's this sense of paying attention and taking notice. He's almost saying to these poor people, I hear you, I hear what you're saying. But of course, look at this metaphor, mind forged. Forged, right, means to kind of construct something, to forcibly use heat, to manipulate a material, right? So if you're forging iron, you're using heat in order to make that iron into a certain shape, right? So here we've got this metaphor of the mind being forged into a shape. And remember, we talked about, and I've talked about this in the context video as well, but the concept of enlightenment, which Blake believed in very heavily. And enlightenment basically meant escaping your class and thinking about yourself and others as individuals. So I think what Blake is saying here is that a lot of these poor people have purposefully had their mind manipulated into believing that they can't rise above their station. The sense that the rich are oppressing poor people's minds. Sense of mind control almost. And I don't think Blake was talking about literal mind control. I don't think he had this idea of physically controlling someone's mind like a witch or a wizard. I'm saying with every group that is oppressed in society, these groups are oppressed because the oppressors, the people in charge, make them believe that they deserve to be where they are. So as I was saying, there was this sense in society of the time that poor people deserved where they were in their life. Poor people deserve to be poor. They deserve to not have homes. They deserved to die early because of their dangerous jobs, and they deserve to be underpaid or unemployed because that's what God intended, right? And that's what the rich told themselves, but that's what the rich also told these poor people, that you deserve what you have in life. Can't climb above and break their class barriers and rise in society because this is what God wanted them to be. So in this sense, that's what I mean by mind control. And I think that's what Blake means by mind-forged manacles. Think about the crime aspect of the noun manacles. There's this sense of being a criminal, that if you are poor, you're kind of a criminal, that all poor people are criminals, that they've done some kind of sin, that they kind of deserve to be locked up. Think about the connotations of being trapped in manacles, right? Your hands are trapped, you're tied up, you're unable to escape. Now think about how this kind of links to the idea of poor people being unable to escape their station in life, and this is because their minds have been controlled. Their minds have almost been manipulated, forged by their oppressors, by the rich people, to believe that they cannot rise above. Okay, again, we've got this use of repetition, cry and every. So it's not just in one stanza that Blake uses a huge amount of repetition. He actually uses this repetition throughout the whole poem. So think about that, the way that repetition is used throughout. What makes this repetition so important is that it is kind of continued on throughout the poem. And if you have watched the context video, we talk a lot about cycles and the way that there's a cyclical kind of aspect to the poem that isn't maybe so obvious. But when you think about the concept of poverty, of children and infants, which are mentioned in the second stanza and in the fourth stanza, being born and crying and probably growing up to become either prostitutes if they're girls or chimney sweeps if they're boys. And remember, chimney sweeps were little boys who were small enough to climb into chimneys, and a lot of them died early of lung poisoning because of the smoke. It poisoned their lungs, or they actually were burnt alive, or they suffocated to death, or they were just trapped in chimneys and died of being trapped. So it was a horrible, horrible job. And yeah, they were little boys, so I'm just going to point that out there. Little boys were chimney sweeps. Usually little girls became prostitutes as young as 8, 9, till the age of whenever they passed away from some sexually transmitted disease or pregnancy complications, or just being exposed to the elements outside, so from heat or from cold, or it was just not nice. So these children babies being born into conditions which they would never really escape from. They would die early, and they would be stuck in these sad, horrible jobs. And there's this cycle aspect that children are constantly being born, growing up, having their own children, which are constantly born to grow up into these oppressing and poor conditions, which I think is really emphasized by the amount of repetition used throughout the poem. And no, it's not just restricted to one stanza. He actually uses it throughout the whole poem. He repeats every throughout the whole poem. He repeats cry throughout the whole poem. He repeats conjunction and is repeated quite a lot throughout the poem, if you point it out. I'm sure there's other things that are repeated throughout the whole poem, but repetition is such a huge structural device in this poem. It's huge, and it really cements this idea of repeating, of cycles, of happening again and again and again, that these chimney sweeps aren't just crying once, they're constantly crying. These poor people are constantly surrounding the rich. They're kind of on the edges of society, and their tears never end. They are constantly calling out, they're constantly cursing, they're constantly suffering. This idea of repetition really gives the idea of constant, repeated suffering. This is also really emphasized by the words that are repeated. So cry is repeated, and we talked about that verb and its impact, and so that repetition of that impact is constantly echoing in the reader's mind. So how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls. Now, again, I know I keep mentioning it, but the context video to this one really highlights Blake's disgust over the church. He really did not like the Church of England. He didn't like conventional Christianity, and he didn't like how the church wasn't helping out, was not doing anything for these poor people. So this adjective blackening is very important. The adjective blackening really gives a sense of darkness. It gives a sense of bleakness meaning hopelessness and desperation. And notice how blackening, right, this verb ends in ing. It's in a kind of continuous present tense. So it's not just every black church appalls, it's blackening, it's becoming blacker and blacker and blacker, it's becoming darker and darker and darker. And I don't know, every single time I read this line and I think about this description in my head, I think of a church that's kind of having black slime climb up it slowly and slowly. And look at this appalls, this verb appalls, this sense that there's something appalling going on here in the church, this sense that something is not right. To appall is to kind of be outraged, to be disgusted by something. So Blake is kind of urging his readers to be disgusted by this blackening, by this almost demonic church. And again, look at blackening as something that is kind of demonic and the opposite of what a church should be. And then we've got, and the hapless soldiers sigh. So if we've got this adjective blackening to describe a church, this powerful institution, we've got the adjective hapless, which basically means helpless, to describe the soldiers. And now look at the way that Blake is kind of referring to war. So soldiers could be referring to these poor people. They could be soldiers as well. You know, there's this kind of military aspect to their misery. And again, we've got this reference to war and revolution as well. This idea, perhaps, that Blake is telling us that the poor people who are shunned in society, who are pushed aside, could very well end up becoming soldiers. But right now they're helpless. They're helpless and they're sighing. And actually, they're sighing out of desperation and sadness. Think about also the conjunction and. I want to point this out, and in a couple of other videos we have talked about the importance of this conjunction and. Kind of gives a sense of continuousness. Blake hasn't just ended the sentence after a pause and then started off with the hapless soldiers sigh. He actually has purposefully included this conjunction and, which links the church to the soldiers. It's not a new sentence, it's linked together. So church is linked to the misery of all these poor people, that the church has a direct influence in making people poor, in hurting people, in adding to these poor people's misery. And again, this very warlike language is really emphasized in runs in blood down palace walls. And again, I want to point out that this could very well and most probably is a direct reference to the French Revolution. There was a lot of violence in the French Revolution, and I definitely think Blake in this sentence is referring to the violence of that could possibly be happening in England as well, as a kind of mimicking of the French Revolution. But also the sentence could very well be referring to how the palace walls, how the rich and any rich person could be living in their own version of a palace. It doesn't necessarily refer to the monarchy. It could very well be any duke or duchess or viscount or baron or baroness who is living in their mansion, which is equated to a palace. And very well, it could be referring to how guilty these rich people are, that these palaces that they are living in has blood metaphorically running down it. So it could be a metaphor. It could be a warning that a British Revolution could be happening. It could also be a metaphor that these houses that these rich people are living in have blood running down them. Metaphorically, that blood belongs to the soldiers, it belongs to the chimney sweeps, it belongs to the harlots, it belongs to any poor person who is slowly dying and is slowly perishing from misery. So it's this very dark imagery. So one thing to know about the last stanza is it starts off with a conjunction. And remember what we always say about conjunctions is that they are used to carry on a topic. I definitely think that this kind of conjunction but, which connects the previous stanza to this one, really gives a sense of informality. It is as if the speaker, this I, this flaneur, is carrying on a kind of conversation to the reader, right? He's kind of talking to them, and there's this informal kind of tone. Now, but is usually used when we speak. So there is this sense that the speaker is speaking to us, and he kind of has this kind of spontaneous thought. It almost is posed as a spontaneous thought. He goes, but most through midnight streets I hear. So it's almost like he's saying, hold on, but this is what I hear when I walk through the midnight streets. So it's this kind of sudden or spontaneous thought that he has, which I definitely think gives the poem a sense of conversation. I think this informal feature gives the speaker, the flaneur, the objective, supposedly objective speaker, some personality. He's not as objective as we might think. He actually does look around him and feel the impact of the poor people he sees. He feels their misery, he feels their sadness, he feels their cries. So there's a sense of maybe at the beginning of the poem, the speaker is this informal, flaneur, distant person who is just observing, not actually getting involved. But by the end, this informal feature, this conjunction, this but, which adds a sense of speech, adds a sense of informality, gives the speaker a sense of personality, and it makes us feel that he is perhaps moved by what he has seen. So there's this almost tone shift in the poem, this sense that the poem perhaps gains a bit more spoken language features as it goes on, giving the speaker, the narrator of the poem in a sense, more personality, more character. So he goes, but most through midnight streets I hear. So it's midnight now, he's in the dark. There's this sense that as the speaker is walking through London, it shifts from day to night, and now it's midnight. Just also notice that repetition of preposition through, in this case that through has just been shortened. It's meant to say through, like fully. It was actually mentioned in the first stanza when the speaker wanders through each charted street. So again, this repetition of through really gives the sense that the speaker is also part of it. And again, he is part of this city. He is moving through this city. He is actually involved in the city. And again, the speaker hears in the present day what's going on. So again, this idea of the speaker hearing, looking, listening, and feeling as well, the sense that the speaker is involved. How the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear. So this idea of the youthful harlot. So we've got this adjective youthful to describe the harlot. Now, harlot means prostitute. So this idea that she is young, that young girls are born into this poverty-stricken world and were probably forced into prostitution. They were probably underpaid. They were definitely raped. They were definitely abused. They would definitely contract sexual diseases, and they would get pregnant very young. There was very little protection for them. And so, yes, most of the time they would also suffer from death during childbirth, or they would probably suffer from diseases due to poor hygiene when they are giving birth. So again, this youthful harlot is too young. She's too young to be a prostitute. She's probably incredibly young, and there's again this sense of injustice within this adjective, youthful. There's no judgment in it, but there's definitely the sense that there is an injustice going on here, that this prostitute shouldn't be so young, that she shouldn't be forced into this life. And she's cursing. Again, this idea of cursing. In the second stanza, remember, we look at the word ban. In every ban, this idea of cursing, this idea of being angry. You know, there's not just sadness, there's not just misery. These people have emotions beyond just being miserable. They are angry. They can feel the injustice. So this youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear. So there's this idea, this image of a young prostitute giving birth to a baby, a newborn infant. This verb blasts. And note the present tense. The speaker is watching this happen in the present tense. And this kind of, again, the loudness of it. To blast with something, to curse and to blast. There's a sense of shouting, of loudness, of almost bombing, this sense of war again, this idea of tearing again, a very violent verb, you know, this idea of tearing the newborn infant's ears out with a curse. But also, again, this could very well be a noun. It could be the noun tear. Think about crying again. Do notice throughout the whole poem how misery and anger are very, very tied together, how cry could very well mean tears, crying of tears and crying of sadness, but also a war cry. Think about the connection between war and anger and that link to sadness and tears. Blake very interestingly uses language to tie those two concepts together until they kind of become one. This idea that misery and sadness creates anger, creates cursing, creates bans. This youthful harlot who's probably cried many times in her life because of the injustices in her life has now almost cried herself out, and now she's cursing, now she's angry, now she's ready to revolt. And also, again, I have mentioned a couple of times, but there is this cyclical element, this idea of being young and youthful, in having babies, and these babies growing up to become chimney sweepers or prostitutes. This cyclical element that every child born in this world ends up dying early, or having more children which are born in this world, which end up growing up and dying early or having more children. There's this sense of being trapped, and there's this sense of having no way out. But there's also this sense of revolution. It's brimming underneath this poem, and it's suggesting that perhaps these poor people are sick of their misery and they're ready to start revolting, and they're ready to escape their entrapment. So again, those two themes of being trapped, but also revolution, of fighting back, those two themes are very, very connected to each other. And again, the last sentence, probably the most interesting sentence, and the saddest sentence really, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So very, very interesting use of language here. So first of all, again, we've got this conjunction, and which really links the sentence previous to this one, this sense of talking, the sense of linking, the sense of elongating a sentence and using and as a form of spontaneous speech, right? So this is a conjunction, and conjunctions usually mimic spontaneous speech. And we've got blights, and blights actually means infect. So it's a verb, and it means to infect. And blights with plagues, plagues we know is a disease, the marriage hearse, and hearse is a coffin. So what is Blake saying here? Now think about the harlot's curse. She is cursing out, and she blights with plagues the marriage hearse. So in a sense, think about this idea of a young woman selling her body and getting infected with plagues. She has sexually transmitted diseases, which she most likely has passed on to her child. That happens, by the way. You can actually transfer a sexually transmitted disease to your child. So it's a sense of infection here, perhaps sexual infection, which is being transferred to this poor newborn infant. The sense that this young girl has had many sexually transmitted diseases, that she is infected, she's blighted with a plague, with a disease, with a STI. And it's almost as if Blake is bringing into question this idea of her marriage, right? He's saying that any rich young girl would probably be thinking of marriage right now, but this youthful harlot has the misfortune of being born into poverty, and so she can't think about marriage. Most likely this baby was born out of rape or by a customer of this harlot. Most likely the father of the baby is not married to the harlot. So there's this idea of irony here, this concept of bringing up marriage in the first place, which is very ironic and also very sad, that any other girl in any other station would probably be married or thinking about marriage, or, you know, have that protection, that security, that back in that time you needed as a young girl to be married in order to be secure and protected. This harlot doesn't have that privilege. And so we've got this kind of contrast, this juxtaposition. This idea of marriage is immediately juxtaposed with hearse, with coffin, this sense that the harlot's chances of being married are dead. You know, you might as well put those chances in a coffin, but also this idea that most likely the harlot will be dead out of childbirth, out of another STI, out of anything, out of brutal rape or abuse. This harlot's life probably won't last very long. She won't be around to raise her newborn infant. There's this sense of death present throughout the whole of the poem, but in this case we've got this real dismal and miserable ending. To end it on coffin, there's this sense of lingering death which is present. I think with the adjective newborn, this sense of vulnerability. I think this vulnerability is also present in this adjective youthful. It's not just the infant that's vulnerable and newborn, it's actually the harlot herself who is having the baby who is vulnerable. There's a sense that she's too young to protect herself, and that she is perhaps, you know, very susceptible to being murdered or abused, or you know, any horrible thing that could happen to a young girl alone on the streets. So there's definitely this sense of lingering death, of taking advantage of these vulnerable people in society. Overall, I definitely think that all poor people are vulnerable, and they're being posed as vulnerable. They're being posed as kind of abused by their oppressors, by these rich people. And there's this sense that I think Blake is saying that, you know, the rich person reading the poem really needs to take accountability. And this is why he uses such strong language. And along this kind of language of vulnerability, of sadness, of misery, of death, of oppression, there is this real thread of revolt, of revolution brewing, this thread of anger. And the harlot herself, as vulnerable as she is, remember, she is cursing, she is angry, she's ready almost to fight, and there's this sense of her almost losing her innocence as well. Look at the juxtaposition between the adjective youthful, which suggests innocence and vulnerability, and then this verb curse, which suggests kind of anger, hostility, hatred, something that you would expect from someone who is a little older, has a bit more experience. This, you know, and you would also expect someone a little bit more older with experience to be having a baby, not such a youthful harlot. So yes, definitely there's a sense of vulnerability present in this stanza and in the poem itself, but there's this also sense of revolution, of anger, of brimming death. And yes, the poem ends in hearse, which could very well be the harlot's coffin. It could also be the newborn infant's coffin. And we've got this sense of tear, as if the newborn infant is also torn out of the harlot's body, is almost wrenched out of her. Maybe she doesn't get to keep him, maybe he's being given away to an orphanage. For whatever reason, there's definitely violence present in this verb tear. But, you know, this coffin could very well be the coffin of the rich people. Now, Blake ends his poem on a mention of a hearse, of plagues, of blighting, of infecting. There's this sense that yes, the harlot is probably infected, you know, with an STI. There's this real physical sense that she probably is infected and that she probably will never marry. But there's also this sense of metaphorical infection. Who is the person doing the infecting? What is the real metaphorical infection here? And I definitely think that Blake is asking us to question who the real infectors are in society, who are the real dangerous people. And I think, you know, it's quite obvious that it is the church, the government, the institutions, the rich people, the monarchs, the aristocrats, who are doing the infecting, who are infecting society with their backwards beliefs.